Michael was just like any other ordinary man trying to keep life together, but deep inside, he carried the weight of responsibilities that many people would find overwhelming. He was a single father, raising his little boy, Daniel, all by himself. Life had not been easy for him. Each morning began before the sun had even risen, and each night ended long after the world had gone quiet. There were times when he wondered how he even managed to keep going, but then he would look at his son's small face, and he would know the answer instantly. Michael's world revolved around Daniel. Every sacrifice he made, every extra hour of work, every meal he skipped just to make sure there was enough for his son, it was all worth it when he saw Daniel smile. But being a single father came with challenges that no one had prepared him for. Bills piled up faster than he could pay them. His job, though steady, didn't pay much, and he often had to pick up extra shifts just to make sure there was food on the table. Some days, exhaustion clung to him so heavily that he felt as if he was walking with stones tied to his feet. His mornings were a race against the clock. He would wake before dawn, his alarm buzzing softly on the nightstand, and quietly slip out of bed so as not to wake Daniel. The small apartment they lived in was humble, just 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a living room, but it was filled with warmth, not because of the space, but because of the love Michael poured into it. He would prepare a quick breakfast, usually oatmeal or toast, and set it on the table for his son. Then, gently, he would wake Daniel, who often clung to the blanket, sleepy-eyed and smiling when he saw his father. After breakfast, Michael would help him get ready for school. Though he was often tired, he tried to keep mornings light-hearted. Sometimes he told Daniel funny stories as they packed his school bag, and other times, he would listen as Daniel talked about his friends and teachers. These little conversations were the bright spots of Michael's day. They reminded him that despite all his struggles, he was doing something right. His son was happy, and that mattered more than anything. Once Daniel was dropped off at school, Michael's real race began. He worked long hours at a local hardware store, where he lifted heavy boxes, arranged shelves, and helped customers find what they needed. His boss was kind enough, but the pay was small, and every dollar mattered. Michael often took on extra hours, even if it meant missing lunch or coming home late. He knew Daniel was too young to understand why his father was gone so much, but Michael hoped that one day, his son would realize that everything had been for him. There were moments when Michael felt the heaviness of loneliness. When he saw families together at the park or mothers dropping off their children at school, he sometimes felt a quiet ache inside. He had once dreamed of a life filled with partnership, where he could share the burdens and joys with someone else. But life had turned out differently, and he had learned to accept it. Instead of dwelling on what he didn't have, he focused on what he did, a son who loved him unconditionally. The evenings were the hardest. By the time Michael picked Daniel up from school and walked home, he was usually drained. Still, he refused to let his fatigue show. He would listen to Daniel chatter about his day, laugh at his little jokes, and help him with homework at the small wooden table in their kitchen. Sometimes the math problems were tough, and Michael wasn't always sure of the answers, but he would sit beside his son, trying, encouraging, and learning along with him. These small acts of patience created a bond that was deeper than words. Dinner was often simple pasta with sauce, rice, and beans, or sometimes soup if money was tight. Michael made sure Daniel's plate was always full, even if it meant giving himself less. He had long ago learned how to go without when needed. His satisfaction came from knowing his son never went to bed hungry. After dinner, they would sometimes watch an old cartoon on their small TV, or Daniel would bring out his favorite storybook for his father to read aloud. These quiet evenings were precious to Michael. They reminded him of the beauty hidden even in ordinary struggles. At night, when Daniel was finally asleep, Michael would sit by the window with a cup of tea. He often thought about the future. Would he always be struggling like this? Would he ever have enough to give Daniel the life he dreamed of? The worries sometimes pressed down on him, but then he would remind himself that tomorrow was another day. He had made it through today, and that in itself was a victory. Despite the hardships, Michael was not bitter. Life had tested him, yes, but it had also given him a reason to fight. His son's laughter was his strength, and his little hand wrapped around his father's larger one was his comfort. Michael knew that struggles were part of the journey, but love gave those struggles meaning. And as long as Daniel was by his side, he could face anything. What made Michael's story unique was not the struggles themselves, but the quiet courage with which he faced them. He never complained. He never gave up. Even on the days when his back ached from lifting boxes, and his eyes burned with sleeplessness, he still found the energy to tuck his son into bed with a gentle smile. To Daniel, he was more than a father, he was a hero, though Michael never saw himself that way. This was his life. Simple, hard, but full of love. Michael didn't know that his path was about to cross with someone else's in a way that would change everything. For now, he was just a struggling single dad doing his best, never realizing that soon, his quiet courage would place him in a moment that would test the very limits of his strength and kindness. It was a late evening, and the air carried that quiet stillness that comes just before night settles in completely. Michael had just finished another long shift at the hardware store. His feet ached, and his back felt heavy from hours of lifting and moving things. All he wanted was to get home, have a cup of tea, and check on Daniel, who was spending the evening at a neighbor's apartment while Michael worked late. The streets were not very busy that night. The little town was the kind where most shops closed early, and only a handful of people could be seen walking under the soft glow of the street lamps. Michael carried a small bag with a few groceries, milk, bread, and some fruit. He liked to surprise Daniel with an apple or banana after school the next day. It was a small thing, but for him, even the little joys mattered. As he walked along the quiet street, he suddenly heard a faint sound. At first, he thought it was just the wind moving through the alleyways, but then he stopped and listened more closely. It was different. It was soft but desperate, the sound of someone crying. Michael frowned and turned his head toward a narrow alley between two old buildings. He paused. The sound grew clearer. It wasn't just one voice, it was two. A woman's quiet sobs, and a child's muffled whimpers. Michael's heart tightened. Something about the sound made him uneasy. He could have just walked past, after all, he was tired, and his son was waiting for him. But Michael was not the kind of man who could ignore someone in need. Slowly, he walked toward the alley, careful not to startle anyone. The dim yellow light from the street barely reached inside, but as his eyes adjusted, he could see two figures huddled near a wall. A woman sat on the ground, holding a small child tightly against her chest. Her clothes were worn and dusty, and her hair looked unkempt, as though she had been through a long and difficult day. The little girl clung to her, trembling, her tiny hands gripping her mother's arm. Michael felt his chest grow heavy at the sight. The woman lifted her head when she noticed him, her eyes wide with fear. For a moment, she seemed ready to run, but she had nowhere to go. Michael raised his hand slightly, showing he meant no harm. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice calm and gentle. "I don't want to scare you. Are you all right?" The woman didn't answer right away. She looked down at her child, brushing a strand of hair from the girl's face, and then looked back at Michael. Her lips parted, but only a whisper came out. We're just tired." Michael could see there was more to it than just tiredness. The way she held her daughter close, the way her eyes darted nervously as if expecting someone to appear, told him something deeper was wrong. But he didn't push her for answers. He knew trust didn't come easily, especially for someone who looked as fragile as she did in that moment. "Do you need water?" Michael asked gently. He reached into his grocery bag and pulled out a bottle he had bought earlier. He placed it on the ground, a few steps away, so she could take it without feeling threatened. After a few seconds, the woman slowly reached out and grabbed it. She gave a sip to her daughter first before drinking herself. Michael crouched down a little, keeping his distance. "My name is Michael. I live nearby. This place isn't safe to stay in, especially at night. Do you have somewhere to go?" The woman lowered her eyes and shook her head slowly. The child pressed her face against her mother's chest, clearly frightened. Michael felt a wave of sympathy wash over him. He thought of Daniel. What if his son were out here in the cold, scared and hungry? The thought was unbearable. "I know you don't know me," Michael said softly. "But I have a small apartment not far from here. It's warm, and you can rest for a while. I'm not rich, but there's food and a safe place for your little one. You don't have to stay here tonight." The woman hesitated. He could see the conflict in her eyes. Trusting a stranger was difficult, but the alternative was spending the night on the cold pavement with her child. Finally, after a long pause, she nodded ever so slightly. Michael offered his hand to help her stand. She hesitated again, then slowly placed her hand in his. Her grip was weak, almost trembling, but there was also a quiet strength in the way she held onto her daughter with the other arm. The walk back to Michael's apartment was quiet. The woman kept her eyes down, and the child rested her head on her mother's shoulder, exhausted. Michael carried her small bag of belongings, which looked worn and almost empty. He didn't ask questions. He knew she would share her story when she was ready. When they reached his apartment building, Michael opened the door and let them in. The small place wasn't fancy. It had peeling paint on the walls and furniture that had seen better days, but it was warm, and it felt like home. Daniel wasn't there yet, he was still with the neighbor. That gave Michael a chance to settle the woman and her child in first. "You can sit here," he said gently, pointing to the couch. "I'll bring some tea." The woman lowered herself carefully onto the couch, holding her daughter close. Michael went into the kitchen and quickly boiled water. He set out 2 cups and a small plate with some crackers, the little he had on hand. When he brought them over, the child's eyes lit up at the sight of food. She reached for a cracker, and her mother helped her nibble on it. Michael sat across from them, not wanting to intrude. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said softly. "I just want you both to feel safe tonight." For the first time, the woman's eyes softened. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she whispered, "Thank you." Michael nodded quietly. He didn't need more than that. Deep inside, he felt something stir, a sense that their paths had crossed for a reason. He didn't know who she was, or what had brought her to that alley, but he knew one thing for sure: helping her and her child was the right thing to do. Little did he know, this simple act of kindness was only the beginning of something far greater. Michael woke the next morning to the soft sound of movement in the living room. For a moment, he thought it was Daniel, but then he remembered the events of the night before. Slowly, he sat up on the couch, rubbing his tired eyes, and looked toward the kitchen. The woman he had brought home was there, quietly preparing a glass of water for her little girl. The child sat on the couch, small legs tucked under a blanket, her eyes bright now that she was rested. She looked so different from the frightened little one Michael had seen huddled in the alley. Michael gave a gentle smile. "Morning," he said softly. The woman turned, almost startled, but then nodded. "Good morning," she replied in a low voice. He could tell she was still cautious, unsure of how much she could trust him, but that was natural. He didn't want to press her with questions. Instead, he went into the kitchen and began preparing breakfast: simple toast with butter and a bit of fruit. He wasn't much of a cook, but he wanted them to feel welcome. As the smell of toasted bread filled the small apartment, Daniel came running in from the neighbors, his school bag bouncing on his shoulder. His face lit up when he saw his father. "Daddy," he exclaimed, hugging Michael tightly. Then his eyes fell on the woman and her daughter. He paused, curiosity spreading across his face. Michael crouched down to his son's level. "Daniel, this is our guest. They're going to stay with us for a little while," he explained gently. Daniel's eyes widened, but then he gave a shy smile and waved at the little girl. "Hi," he said simply. The little girl looked up at her mother before giving the smallest of waves back. It was shy, but it was enough to make Daniel grin. Children had a way of finding comfort in each other without needing many words. Breakfast that morning was different. Instead of just father and son sitting at the small kitchen table, there were 4 people. It felt almost like a family gathering, though unspoken questions lingered in the air. The woman barely spoke, but when she watched her daughter nibble happily on the toast, a trace of relief crossed her tired face. After breakfast, Daniel left for school, and the apartment grew quiet again. Michael could sense that the woman wanted to say something, but words seemed hard for her to find. He didn't push. Instead, he simply said, "You're welcome to rest here as long as you need. I don't have much, but you're safe here." She looked at him for a long moment, as though searching his face for hidden intentions. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "My name is Sarah," she said. She placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. "And this is Emma." Michael smiled. "It's nice to meet you, Sarah. And you too, Emma." The little girl peeked at him from behind her mother's arm and then buried her face shyly again. Michael chuckled softly. "She's safe. No need to be shy." As the day passed, Sarah slowly began to relax. She still didn't share much about what had brought her to that alley, but she accepted Michael's kindness with quiet gratitude. She helped with small chores around the apartment, folding the laundry and sweeping the floor. Emma followed Daniel around after school, her tiny footsteps echoing his as if she had found a new friend she could trust. The sight of the 2 children playing together touched Michael's heart in a way he hadn't expected. Daniel was usually a little quiet, but with Emma around, he laughed more freely, sharing his toys and even offering her his favorite storybook. Emma, who had been so withdrawn the night before, began to smile. It was a fragile smile, but it lit up the room. That evening, Michael prepared a simple dinner: pasta with tomato sauce. The 4 of them sat together again at the small table. This time, the air felt lighter. Sarah even allowed herself a small laugh when Daniel made a silly face to cheer Emma up. For Michael, it felt like something he hadn't realized he was missing. His home was usually filled with love, but now it was filled with something more: a sense of family. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Michael sat by the window with a cup of tea. Sarah joined him, her hands wrapped around her own cup. For a while, they sat in silence, listening to the distant sounds of the city. Finally, Sarah spoke. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly. "You didn't have to help us, but you did. You gave us a place to rest, food, and kindness. People don't usually do that." Michael looked at her and shook his head. "Sometimes life is hard," he said gently. "I know what it feels like to struggle, to feel alone. If I can make things a little easier for someone else, even just for a day, then it's worth it." Sarah's eyes glistened as she looked down into her cup. She didn't say more, but her silence spoke volumes. There was a story behind her eyes, a story she wasn't ready to tell yet. Michael respected that. He knew trust couldn't be rushed. In the days that followed, the apartment seemed brighter. Daniel and Emma quickly grew inseparable. They would play with blocks on the floor, draw with crayons, and laugh at small jokes only children understood. Their laughter was contagious, and even Sarah found herself smiling more often. For Michael, it was heartwarming to see. Though his life was still filled with struggles, long hours at work, bills that seemed never ending, there was now a new kind of energy in his home. It reminded him that even small acts of kindness could grow into something much larger than he had expected. One evening, as he watched the children fall asleep on the couch, their heads resting close together, Michael realized something important. He had always thought of himself as a man who was just surviving, just getting by for the sake of his son. But now, with Sarah and Emma in his home, he felt something different stirring in his heart. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living, about finding meaning in helping others, and about discovering the strength of compassion. His apartment, though still small and worn, no longer felt empty. It felt alive. Sarah still hadn't shared her full story, and Michael didn't ask. He believed that when she was ready, she would open up. For now, it was enough to know that she trusted him enough to stay, enough to let her daughter play freely with his son, enough to sit quietly by the window and share tea. And though Michael couldn't see the future, he had a quiet sense that life was leading him towards something far greater than he could imagine. The days passed in a gentle rhythm. Michael continued working long hours at the hardware store, and each evening when he returned home, he found Sarah and Emma in his apartment with Daniel. The children's laughter often filled the small living room, and Sarah would sometimes be in the kitchen helping prepare a simple meal. Michael had grown used to their presence. It was strange how quickly strangers could become part of one's life. Sarah wasn't a guest anymore, she felt more like family. She spoke more now, though carefully, and her smile appeared more often. Emma, once quiet and withdrawn, now ran through the apartment with Daniel, her laughter echoing down the hallway. Still, Michael knew there was a story Sarah hadn't told yet. Sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, her eyes grew distant, as though heavy with memories. He didn't ask questions. He believed she would share when she was ready. One cool morning, after dropping Daniel and Emma at school, Michael returned home to find Sarah sitting quietly at the table with a folded piece of paper in her hands. She looked up when he entered, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I've been thinking," she began softly. "I don't want to be a burden to you. You've done more than enough for us already." Michael sat across from her, shaking his head. "You're not a burden," he said firmly. "This home is open to you. I mean it." Her eyes glistened, but she quickly looked down at the paper in her hands. "It's just, we've been running from something for a long time. And I'm afraid it might catch up with us." Michael's chest tightened at her words, but before he could ask anything, there was a sudden knock on the door. It was sharp and unexpected, cutting through the morning quiet. Sarah froze, clutching Emma's small sweater that lay on the table. Her face paled. Michael stood and walked toward the door. He opened it slowly, and to his surprise, two uniformed police officers stood in the hallway. They greeted him politely, though their eyes were serious. "Mr. Michael?" one of them asked. "Yes," Michael replied cautiously. "We're here to ask you a few questions. May we come in?" Michael hesitated but stepped aside, allowing them in. Sarah's hands tightened around the paper, her knuckles white. Emma wasn't there, she was still at school, but Sarah looked as though her whole world had just stopped. The officers sat down, and one of them pulled out a small notebook. "We've been following a case involving a missing woman and her child," he explained. "They've been gone for several months. Neighbors, friends, and even teachers reported them missing. We've been searching everywhere. Recently, we received information that they might be in this area." Michael's heart began to race. He glanced at Sarah, who sat silently, her eyes filled with tears she couldn't hold back any longer. The officer continued gently, "We believe the woman and her daughter are here with you. Is that correct?" Michael looked at Sarah, giving her a reassuring nod before answering. "Yes. They've been staying here. I found them a few nights ago in an alley. They didn't have anywhere to go." The room fell into a heavy silence. Sarah wiped at her cheeks, finally whispering, "I didn't mean to hide forever. I just needed to keep my daughter safe." The officers exchanged a glance, but their expressions softened. "Ma'am," one said kindly, "you don't need to be afraid anymore. You and your daughter are safe now. We've been searching for you to make sure you're okay." Sarah's shoulders shook as she finally let the tears fall. All this time, she had been carrying the weight of fear and uncertainty, and now the truth had surfaced. She and Emma had been missing persons, their disappearance sending worry through the community. Michael sat quietly, processing the revelation. He had known there was more to Sarah's story, but he hadn't realized it was this big. The woman and child he had taken into his home weren't just strangers in need, they were the missing family the police had been desperately trying to find. One of the officers turned to Michael. "You should know, sir, your actions helped bring them to safety. By offering shelter, you gave them the chance to be found without harm. You did the right thing." Michael felt a mix of emotions: relief that Sarah and Emma were safe, shock at the gravity of their situation, and a quiet pride that his simple choice to help had meant so much. Sarah reached across the table, her trembling hand resting on Michael's. "I don't know what would have happened to us if you hadn't stopped that night," she whispered. "You gave us a home when we had nothing. You gave Emma hope." The officers assured Sarah that arrangements would be made to support her and Emma, to ensure they had safety and resources moving forward. They explained that people in the community had been deeply worried, and news of their safety would bring relief to many. As the officers left, promising to return with further details, the apartment grew quiet again. Sarah sat still, her face pale but lighter somehow, as though a great burden had finally been lifted. Michael sat across from her, still trying to absorb everything. Daniel returned from school later that day, with Emma at his side. The two children ran into the apartment, laughing and carrying their drawings. Sarah watched them with tears in her eyes, realizing how close she had come to losing these simple joys forever. Michael crouched down to Daniel's level and smiled at Emma. "You're both very special," he told them. "And everything is going to be all right now." Though he still didn't know every detail of Sarah's journey, Michael understood something important: sometimes, life placed people in our path for reasons we couldn't see at first. His decision to stop that night, to offer help instead of walking away, had led to this moment. It was shocking, yes, but it was also powerful. It reminded him that kindness, even when small, could change the course of someone's entire life. That night, as Sarah tucked Emma into the borrowed bed, and Michael tucked Daniel into his own, the apartment was quiet, but it carried a sense of peace. There were still challenges ahead, but the fear that had once hung over Sarah's every step had begun to lift. And for Michael, the single father who had once thought his life was nothing more than a series of struggles, this moment showed him that his courage and kindness mattered more than he had ever imagined. The days after the police visit brought many changes, but they also brought something unexpected: peace. For the first time in months, Sarah no longer had to live in hiding, no longer had to glance over her shoulder with fear. And little Emma, who had once clung to her mother with wide, worried eyes, now laughed freely with Daniel, filling Michael's small apartment with the kind of joy he never knew he needed. Michael often found himself sitting quietly in the evenings, watching the two children play with blocks on the floor or draw colorful pictures at the kitchen table. Their laughter carried through the apartment, softening the edges of his tired heart. Sometimes he caught Sarah watching them too, her hand resting against her cheek, her eyes filled with relief and love. It amazed Michael how quickly life had changed. Just weeks earlier, his days had been filled with nothing but work, bills, and exhaustion. He had thought his story was only about survival, getting through each day for the sake of his son. But now, with Sarah and Emma in his life, he felt something different, a sense of purpose that reached beyond his own struggles. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Michael sat at the table with Sarah. A small lamp cast a warm glow across the room. Sarah sipped her tea slowly before setting the cup down with a quiet sigh. "I never thought I would find a place that felt safe again," she said softly. "But you gave that to us." You didn't know me, yet you opened your home, your heart. I'll never forget that. Michael shook his head. You don't need to thank me. Anyone would have done the same. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, her eyes steady. No, she said firmly. Not everyone would. Many people would have walked past. But you didn't. You stopped. You saw us when no one else did. Her words stayed with Michael long after she went to bed. He thought about the truth in them. There had been a choice that night in the alley, a choice to keep walking or to stop. And by stopping, by offering his hand, his couch, his tea, he had changed not just Sarah and Emma's lives, but his own as well. As the weeks turned into months, Sarah slowly began to rebuild. With help from local community services, she found part-time work and started planning for a fresh start. Emma blossomed, her shy smile turning into bright laughter, her tiny hands always reaching for Daniel's as if he were her brother. The apartment, though still small and modest, felt fuller than ever before. Michael noticed changes in himself too. He no longer felt the heavy weight of loneliness pressing on his shoulders. His struggles at work still existed, and bills still came, but they didn't feel as crushing as before. He had learned that strength wasn't just about carrying your own burdens, it was also about sharing kindness with others, even when you had little to give. One Saturday afternoon, Michael took Daniel, Sarah, and Emma to the park. The children ran through the grass, chasing each other with laughter ringing in the air. Sarah sat on a bench beside Michael, her hair catching the sunlight, her eyes following Emma with a softness that only a mother could carry. "Look at them," she said with a smile. "They act like they've been friends forever." Michael nodded, watching Daniel gently help Emma climb onto the slide. "Children don't see the world the way adults do," he said. "They don't worry about the past. They just love easily." Sarah glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe that's what we should all do. Learn to see life the way children do. With less fear, more hope." Michael smiled at her words. They were simple, but they carried truth. He realized he had learned just as much from Daniel and Emma as they had learned from him. Their innocence, their ability to find joy in the smallest things, had reminded him what life was really about. Later that evening, as the children fell asleep on the couch after a long day of play, Michael covered them with a blanket. Sarah watched quietly from the kitchen doorway. "You're a good father," she said gently. Michael paused, looking down at Daniel's peaceful face. "I try," he said. "No," Sarah corrected softly. "You don't just try. You succeed. You've given Daniel a home filled with love, even when life wasn't easy. That's what makes a father." Her words touched Michael deeply. For years, he had wondered if he was enough, if Daniel would grow up feeling he had missed out because his family wasn't complete. But hearing Sarah say those words gave him a new kind of strength. He wasn't perfect, but he was enough. The shocking truth the police had revealed had been heavy at first, but now it seemed like a turning point, a moment that had shown Michael the importance of what he had done. He hadn't just opened his door that night, he had opened his life to change. Months later, as Sarah prepared to move into her own small apartment nearby, there was a bittersweet feeling in the air. Emma would still see Daniel often, and Sarah promised they would remain close, but things would be different. On their last evening all together in Michael's apartment, they sat at the table sharing a simple meal, laughing and telling stories. When it was time for them to leave, Sarah hugged Michael tightly. "We'll never forget what you did for us," she whispered. "You gave us more than a place to stay, you gave us hope when we had none." Emma hugged Daniel, promising to see him soon. The children's friendship was too strong to be broken by distance. After they left, Michael sat quietly in the apartment. The silence felt strange at first, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the memory of laughter, with the lessons he had learned, and with the quiet pride that came from knowing he had made a difference. He looked at Daniel, who was already setting up his toys on the living room floor. Michael smiled and joined him, realizing something important. His struggles hadn't disappeared, but they no longer defined him. What defined him was his heart, his courage, and his ability to love and help others even when life was hard. And that, he realized, was more powerful than anything else. From that day forward, Michael carried himself differently. He no longer saw himself as just a struggling single dad. He was a man who had faced challenges, yes, but he was also a man who had made a choice to stop, to help, to love. That choice had changed everything. Life continued, with its ups and downs, its bills and responsibilities. But in the quiet moments, when he watched his son sleep or listened to the sound of laughter in the park, Michael knew that he had found something many people spent their whole lives searching for: meaning. He had discovered that kindness could be stronger than fear, that hope could rise even in the darkest times, and that sometimes, the most ordinary people could make the most extraordinary difference. And so, the story of a struggling single dad was no longer just about hardship. It was about love, courage, and the power of compassion, a reminder that even the simplest act of kindness could ripple outward, changing lives in ways no one could ever predict.